Okay, now we're going to talk about abuse. Before I go through the slides, I want to talk to you a little bit about the video that you just saw. You watched a video from the Department of Justice, and that video described to you that it is your legal duty to report abuse. Let me start by saying that they are correct. You are in a community or facility setting where it is your responsibility to ensure that if you see anything, you know anything, you hear anything, that you immediately report anything to your supervisor. Always follow the chain of command. So if you're a caregiver, you're going to report to your nurse on duty. If you're a nurse, you're going to report to your head nurse. If you are the head nurse, you're going to report to the executive director. Ultimately, all reports go to the executive director. If you have reported something and your person that you reported to, whether it be the manager or leadership team member that was on staff, it could be the activity director, it could be marketing, it could be the front desk. If somebody did not come back to you with an outcome and or say, thank you for the report, we're following up on it, then it's your duty to continue to follow up with it until you get feedback. You don't need to submit reports. You don't need to call licensing yourself. You don't need to call, the police or do anything. As long as you report it, then you are good to go. So as I go through the slides, I'm going to pause a little bit and share with you some scenarios about abuse. But let's start going through these slides. Okay, so elder and dependent abuse in persons with dementia. So what do you think the most common types of abuse are? So in California has the most people over 65, almost 2 million elders. I'm sure the number has grown even more. 47% of the population over 85 suffer from dementia. As the population of older people grows, so does the hidden problems of elder abuse and neglect. Elder and dependent abuse and neglect is a serious problem that affects 1.2 million and 2 million older adults annually in this country. For every case that's reported, experts estimate that there are as many as 5 cases that have not been reported. Other studies estimate that there's only 1 in 10 cases reported. Elder and dependent abuse is the term when an intentional or neglect act by a caregiver causes physical harm or serious injury, physical or mental pain to a vulnerable adult. The caregiver may be a family member or paid caregiver. The abuse may be the following. So there's neglect and abandonment, failing to meet the person's basic needs for food, of water, shelter, leaving the person without proper care. Physical. This is the use of physical force causing physical pain or harm, such as hitting, beating, or restraining the person. Financial. Misuse or theft of a victim's money or possessions. Sexual. Any sexual activity without consent or when the person is unable to give consent, such as the person with dementia. Emotional and psychological. An action causing emotional distress, such as isolating the person. So before I go to the next slide, I want to touch a little bit on some of these topics here. So neglect and abandonment. So this one here falls under, again, meeting the basic needs. You saw in the video how you can have a resident who's asking you for food or water and the caregiver walks away or says, no, I'm not going to give it to you, or leaves them locked in a bathroom. So this could be under neglect and abandonment, or the resident has to go to the bathroom and you fail to take them. Physical obviously means hitting somebody. So on this one, I'm going to share with you a story, and I'll make it, I'll wrap it up really quickly here, but I want to bring the point across to you. So I had a community that it was a larger community. It was all dementia. And we had full staff. So we had a private caregiver that had come in to take care of one of our residents. And when the caregiver was there, this was a caregiver that was well liked by the family, had been with the resident for quite some time. The maintenance gentleman, really early in the morning, would pass by the room and would hear the resident crying or, whimpering. So one day he decided to stop by the room, and as he stopped by the room, he looked in, and in the bathroom, he noticed the caregiver socking the resident. So he didn't say anything. He kind of kept it to himself and kind of let it ponder. 2 weeks went by, and as he continued one morning coming in, he noticed it again. So he then decided that day, later in the afternoon, to report this to one of his colleagues, which was a housekeeper. And the housekeeper immediately told him, "No, you have to report this. This is abuse." So she took him, and they immediately went to the social worker that was on duty and reported to the social worker. And the social worker said, "Okay, thank you for letting me know." The social worker then went and told the registered nurse that was on duty. Well, both of them decided that they would wait until the next day to report this. I was the executive director on duty. So the next morning came about, and in our stand-up meeting, the registered nurse shared that this report had come into her. So I immediately stopped the meeting, and I asked them to go up and get the caregiver and dismiss her. I opened up an investigation, and unfortunately, what ended up happening was, because the caregiver was abusing the resident, I had to terminate the maintenance director. I had to terminate the social worker. I had to terminate the registered nurse, and obviously the caregiver as well. The only one that was not terminated was the housekeeper, because she immediately reported. So in that video that you watched, it does talk about reporting abuse. Your timeline for reporting abuse is immediately. It should not be the next day. It should not be, "I'm going to wait till the end of my shift." It should not be the next morning. It should be immediately. So if you hear or see anything, it's better that you report it, because the last thing that you want is to lose your fingerprint clearance. You don't want the government or federal to get involved, and then, or the state to come in, because the first thing they're going to do is tell me or tell the Raya's Paradise that I have to terminate your employment, and then they're going to strip you of your fingerprints. So if you think or you see anything, the best thing to do is report it. Let us investigate. Even if we find that nothing happened, the best thing that you did was report. So let's go on to our next slide. So there's 3 types of elder abuse. So one is domestic elder abuse. So this is done by family or paid caregiver in the home. And then you have institutional elder abuse. That's a nursing home, board and care, assisted living. It's paid and no relationship. And then you have, obviously, the self-abuse, when the elder person fails to meet their own physical, social, or emotional needs. So these are the 3 types of abuse. So some of the statistics, the victims, the elder independent abuse occurs in all races, all educational or religious backgrounds. The majority is 77.1 of the victims are Caucasian. The majority of the abuse is 89.3 occurs in the home. Elder abuse victims are generally over 75, female, and either single or widowed. People with dementia are unable to report abuse. Resident-to-resident abuse occurs when one resident in the facility abuses another resident in the same facility. The abuse could be physical, emotional, or mental. In all the studies reviewed, neglect was the most common type that was identified. So the following statistics were from 2019. APS is called Adult Protective Services. So just like we have Child Protective Services, there's Adult Protective Services. So self-abuse was the highest one at 47.2. Then you have neglect, financial, emotional, physical, sexual, and other. So these are statistics from Adult Protective Services. So some of the behavioral warning signs that you will see is frequent arguments or tension between the caregiver and the elderly person. So sometimes if you notice that the resident is not reacting well to the caregiver, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's abuse, but it could be that something has happened. Sometimes it's those caregivers that have known the resident for a while and not inside the community. I'm talking the caregiver that's coming from the outside into our community, and they're hired as private one-on-ones. So you're looking for changes in the personality, whether they're withdrawn, they're depressed, they're refusing to walk. or talk openly, they're frightened or angry. These warning signs are more difficult to notice in people with dementia because some of the above behaviors are possibly from the dementia progressing. So always look for the clusters of behavior. So if you notice that the caregiver shows up and or a family member shows up and the resident gets really agitated, then maybe you should observe a little bit longer. Elders with dementia are at greater risk from abuse because they're unable to report the abuse or stop the abuse, so making them more vulnerable. What may be seen when a person has severe dementia is being abused is an unusual fear of cowering away from one specific person. So here's some misconceptions. So incorrect. The elder abuse only occurs in nursing homes. That's not correct. Paid caregivers inflict the most abuse. That's not correct either. There's a single pattern of abuse. Not correct. Only frail or mentally impaired people are abused. Not correct. Abusers are violent people who enjoy hurting others. Not correct. So here's some of the correct terms for abuse or things of abuse. The majority of elder abuse occurs in the home. So 95% of the people living in home, and only 4% of the elders live in nursing homes. So this is an interesting statistic because you would think that a lot of abuse occurs inside of settings like ours, but that is not true. Most of the time, the abuse occurs in somebody's home. You family members are the greatest abusers. So most elders live on their own with their family, and the most common abuser is the adult child of the victim. So this could be a child who is, suffering financially, needs help from their parent. The parent is elderly and they know that mom or dad has money, so they're abusing them by not providing the care, not getting the care for them, and they're taking their funds. So this is the most common type. Most often the abuse is related to changes in the living situation of a family. So the abuse can take place in different forms, different times. Some of the time the abuse is continuation for a long-standing patterns of abuse, such as spousal abuse or emotional abuse within a family member. So in this one here, I did have a spouse who was admitting his wife, and when he brought his wife to me, he said to me, I haven't, my wife has had some, challenges with her cognitive and she hasn't let me shower her. And I said, how long has it been since she's had a shower? And he said, it's probably been a good 5 years. I was in shock. And so when the resident was admitted, she had a rash all over her body from head to toe rash. Well, it turned out it wasn't a rash. It was actually scabies. And he had scabies as well. So scabies is a little bug that goes under your skin, and then once it starts to crawl throughout your body, then it's everywhere. It's itchy, very uncomfortable. So that is a form of abuse without the spouse knowing, but it was a form of abuse because of a lack of shower and or neglect. So he didn't want a caregiver in the home, so he basically just let her be. So it is a form of abuse. Any elder can find themselves in an abusive situation. Disabled, ill, depressed, or people with dementia are at greater risk. Family stress is the major factor contributing to elder abuse. The typical abuser is unable to handle stress well, so they pass it on to their parent. So some of the types of abuse: if you suspect abuse but you're not sure, look for the clusters of physical or behavioral signs. Generally, more than one sign will be present. So victims may have signs of several types of abuse. For example, the person may be dirty, dehydrated, neglect, may have multiple bed sores and bruises, physical, and is treated like a child or ignored by the caregiver. This is considered emotional abuse. And you saw this on the video that you watched. Again, so if you're a caregiver at nighttime and you have to make rounds to change the residents who are incontinent, so that's every 2 hours, and you don't do it, and then the morning shift comes aboard and they say that the resident was soiled, that is a form of abuse because you're neglecting to take care of your resident, and that is a reportable abuse. So keep in mind that if you're a caregiver at night or even during the day, our toileting is every 2 hours. So residents with dementia who can no longer go to the bathroom, if you're not refusing, but you neglect to take them to the bathroom, you say, oh, the next shift could do it, that is a form of abuse. So all of those things need to be taken into consideration because you are taking care of a vulnerable resident. So some of the things of neglect are consist of isolation, confinement, the lack of needed services. Neglect occurs when food, fluids, clothing, shelter, medications, personal care of supervision, comfort, health care, or protection are not provided by the caregiver. Neglect can either be physical or emotional. Abandonment is a type of neglect when a caregiver deserts the elderly person. For example, of abandonment, which is a group of residents are taken to the park for an outing. One person wanders off unnoticed. The group leaves the park without the resident. The missing resident is not missed by the caregiver until dinner time. So that is a form of abandonment. Another form would be if a family member knows their loved one needs care, they can't move, they're confined to their bed, and they leave the home to go to work and they leave them all day in their bed. That is 100% a form of neglect and abandonment. So some of the signs and indicators of physical neglect include malnutrition, so not enough food, dehydration, not enough fluids, sunken eyes from dehydration can be visible. So untreated bed sores or multiple bed sores, poor personal hygiene, so feces or urine in clothing, their teeth and hair not brushed, unshaven and not bathed. So this is all part of signs of physical abuse. Lack of necessary dentures, hearing aids, or glasses, unusual weight loss, so no notification to the doctor or family, no attempts to improve the nutrition, and no documentation of what's being done about the problem. So all of this is a form of physical abuse. Signs of physical neglect. So inadequate hand washing or part of the caregiver causing infection, untreated medical conditions, or delay in medical treatments, improper body positioning resulting in limb contracture or skin breakdown, unsafe living conditions, dangerous conditions. Newspaper stacked to the ceiling, no food in the refrigerator, no heat and running water, or improper wiring. So this mostly happens at home, but in a community like ours, we talked a little bit about how repositioning somebody, not letting them sit in a certain spot for hours and hours and causing skin breakdown is a form of neglect. So unclean living conditions, soiled bedding, fleas, roaches, lice, urine smell, no functioning toilet. So this would be, in our setting, would be if you knew the bed was soiled and you left the bed sheets the way they were and then you laid the resident back down. So that is a form of neglect. And or you didn't change them, or you knew it was their shower day and you went days and days without showering them. So lack of supervision or monitoring, lack of adequate toileting, and not changing briefs leading to skin breakdown. So all of this is a form of physical neglect. Then we have emotional neglect, so ignoring, moaning, signs of distress, ignoring the person's need for affection, hugs, or smiles, failure to provide needed medications for psychological or emotional problems, isolating a person from friends or family, not allowing the visitors, not allowing the use of a telephone, and not allowing TV or other forms of entertainment are all forms of emotional neglect. So some examples or situations. So here we've got a nurse allows a caregiver to feed a person a turkey sandwich when a person is on a pureed diet. This is a form of neglect. A caregiver takes a person's food away, even though the person is still eating their food. So keep this one in mind. So if you're a caregiver and your resident is eating, but you know they can't really communicate with you and they take their food away, or you take their food away and they're still eating, that is a form of neglect. The hospice social worker making a home visit or a community visit notices that the person is very medicated and cannot stand up or even answer questions. This can be a form of neglect because it could be that potentially somebody's being over-medicated. You arrive at work and while making rounds, you notice that the resident has obviously been left in urine-soaked pajamas for hours by the previous shift. That's a form of neglect. A fall occurs because a person was not toileted and the person attempts to reach the bathroom alone. This can be a form of neglect. So let's talk about physical abuse. So physical abuse occurs when a caregiver uses enough force to cause unnecessary pain. Physical abuse occurs when a person is hit, pushed, kicked, bitten, or severely beaten, assault, or battery. So physical abuse I shared with you earlier on the resident caregiver who was physically assaulting the resident. That was physical abuse. So some signs that you would see would be trauma, such as scratches, bruises, marks around the wrist, arms next to the neck or the neck of the person, black eyes. So black eyes, this can also be from a fall. So just because you notice that, let's say you were off, you left and then you were off for the next 2 days, and then you come back and you notice bruising under the resident's eyes, it doesn't mean that somebody's being abused. It could be that they fell. Usually when somebody falls and they hit the top part of their head, or maybe in any part of this area at the top, the blood's going to flow down and you're going to see the black underneath their eyes. So don't necessarily think that somebody's being abused, because the black eyes can be from a fall. Signs of being restrained, such as ropes, burns, welts around the wrist or ankles, or gag marks. I did have a resident or a caregiver one time resident was restless at night, so she decided to use the bed sheets to tie the resident to the bed so the resident wouldn't get up. That is a form of physical abuse. You cannot use bed sheets to tie your residents down. Burn marks from hot water or cigarettes. Unexplained repeated fractures or sprains. Signs of excessive drugging, so using medication, the caregiver telling the nurse, you need to give them more medications because they won't sleep. So that could be a form of abuse. Injuries from hitting, punching, or twisting of limbs, inconsistent explanation of injuries, repeated lag times between the time of injury occurs and treatment, any injuries that show an outline of the object, such as a belt buckle cord, and intense fear of people in general or to a specific person. Some examples: a person refuses to have a shower, so the caregiver grabs the person and pulls them into the shower. That's a form of physical abuse. While changing the brief of a person, the person grabs the blouse of the caregiver. The caregiver slaps the person's hands. That's a form of physical abuse. The person with dementia spits at the caregiver, and the caregiver in turn spits back at the person. That is a form of abuse. Remember, you're taking care of residents with dementia, so they're going to do things to you that are not right, or they're going to maybe hit you, they're going to pull your hair, pull your shirt, they're going to do things, even push you. Don't do it back to them, because they're suffering from a cognitive disorder. You are their caregiver. You are the person that's here to help them. If you do anything back to them, it's considered abuse, and it will be reported, and you will lose your job, and you may potentially lose your fingerprints. Don't want to do that. Then we have financial abuse. This really occurs more at home, but we'll talk about it. It includes stealing money, belongings from another person. The most widespread type of financial abuse is telemarketing fraud, home improvement scams, estate planning scams, and of course, you've got identity theft. So some examples of financial abuse is an elderly person has a cell phone given to them by their family member. The caregiver uses the cell phone for personal use. You saw this in the video. An elder is asked if they would like a pizza, to which the person agrees. The pizza is ordered by the caregiver, paid for by the elderly person, and then eaten by the caregiver. The elder is not offered any part of the pizza. This is considered financial abuse. So some psychological and emotional abuse. Emotional abuse can be ranged from name calling to threatening the individual, emotional neglect of lack of basic emotional support, respect, and love. When people have dementia, some indicators of emotional abuse are unusual behaviors such as sucking, biting, or rocking. Signs of emotional abuse are considered ignoring the person, harassment by name calling, insulting, humiliating, treating the person like a child, talking in front of the person as if she or he is not there, threatening to punish or deprive the person, yelling or screaming, locking the person in a dark room or closet. Examples of emotional or psychological abuse. So the caregiver is angry at the elder and gives them a silent treatment, refusing to answer the elder's questions or respond to them. The senior services caregiver enters the elder's home and finds the client locked in the bedroom. The person is just sitting on the bed with no activities available and no food or water. So that's considered abuse. The elder suffers from dementia and hits a caregiver during undressing for a shower. The caregiver yells at the person and calls them names all during the shower. the elder becomes frightened of the caregiver. The elder spills food on the front of the shirt. The caregiver begins calling the person baby and making fun of them. He tells other caregivers how dumb and stupid the person has become. So these are all forms or examples of some psychological abuse that occurs. Then we have sexual abuse. Sexual abuse can range from sexual touching to rape. Spying on an elder while undressing and using the bathroom is considered sexual abuse. Telling sexual stories or dirty jokes in front of an elder can be sexual abuse. Now, let me pause a little bit here. So the residents, because they're suffering from dementia, you will notice that you have some residents that will use inappropriate sexual comments. They may make comments to you. They may ask you to join them in bed. This is not abuse to you. Again, don't forget they are suffering from a cognitive disorder. This applies only if you are making the comments, you are talking inappropriate in front of them and or touching them inappropriate. All of this is considered sexual abuse. Again, it's not if the resident's doing it to you or the resident's doing it to anyone else. It's if you are doing it to any resident. Now, we do have situations where it could be resident to resident. So all of those need to be taken into consideration. If you have two residents that are holding hands and they want to be together, as long as both of the families are aware. So if you have a family member that is not wanting their loved one to be part of or hold hands with another resident, then it's your job and duty to make sure that we separate them and keep them away from each other, keeping in mind they have dementia. We may have some issues, but always report this to your supervisor or the nurse on duty. So some of the signs and indicators of sexual abuse were unexplained vaginal or anal tearing, torn or bloody underwear, vaginal infections, unusual vaginal smells or discharge, bruises around the genital area or breast in women, pornographic videos, movies, or magazines left by a caregiver. So some of the causes of elder abuse, elder abuse is a very complex problem. Generally, there's more than one factor involved in abuse. The most common causes are listed below. So caregiver stress from caring for the elder person, caring for a dependent person with many needs. As for a combative, difficult person is very stressful. So if the resident is combative, you have a very difficult resident, it could put a lot of stress on a caregiver. Often the caregiver is sleep deprived, as little as personal time when caring for a person in the home. As older adults, dependency increases, so does resentment and stress of the caregiver. So all of this, keep this in mind as you care for our residents, that it can take a toll. So take a step back, ask the supervisor if you can take care of somebody else for the day instead of the resident who's very difficult. Some of the stresses from outside factors could be maybe the caregiver, and not so much caregiver. This is like a term for everyone. It could be, anyone working in any department. It could be housekeeping, laundry. It could be the kitchen. So maybe the staff members having some financial problems at home. Stress from a job while trying to care for a dependent person at home increases the risk of abuse. Family concerns and multiple responsibilities add to the behavior or some of the behaviors. The emotional toll of caring for an elder can increase abuse. Caregiver dependency on the elder for financial support. History of violence in the family learned as a child. When a caregiver uses drugs, abuses alcohol, or has mental emotional problems, the risk for abuse increases. Social isolation increases the risk of abuse because the caregiver does not have the support or emotional outlets to handle the stress for caring for the elder. Complex family structure, blended family, non-relative. So how to report abuse. So you heard this in the video, and I talked about it a little bit at the beginning. So because elder independent abuse is a complex problem and it's easy to have misconceptions, reviewing the observations or suspected abuse with supervisor is recommended. However, the individual is still responsible to report suspected and observe abuse himself. So as I shared with you earlier, it's your duty, your legal duty, to continue to report until the executive director and or your manager comes to you, supervisor comes and says, thank you for reporting this. We are taking action. Now, once somebody reports abuse, if they are reporting abuse saying that you have done something, just because they reported it doesn't mean that it's actually true facts. So the thing I have to do, or the steps I have to do, is once I receive the report, I have to suspend you for 3 days. Once then I open an investigation. If I find that the abuse is unsubstantiated, which means that I didn't find any evidence of abuse, I pay you for the days that you were out and I bring you back to work. If I find the abuse was substantiated, you immediately get terminated and it gets reported to the state. So again, anything, keep in mind, if you're passing by a room and you hear that a resident is screaming, feel free to knock on the door. 90% of the time, the chances of the staff member abusing the resident are slim. It's most likely the resident is hitting the staff member. And usually what's happening is they don't want the shower, they don't want to be cared for, so they're screaming and yelling because they don't want the care. So it's okay to go in and check, knock on the door, and make sure that everything's okay. It's when you see something and you don't report it, that's where we have the bigger issue. Some situations are obviously abusive and need to be reported immediately. When someone is in danger, notify the local law enforcement agency and wait until the police arrives before leaving. Again, it's not your duty to call the police, it's the facility. So you are in a setting where you do have lots of supervisors. So your duty to report to your supervisor, and then the supervisor will then take it from there. Submit the report, call local law enforcement, call the family, call the doctor, and then we take it from there. Do not keep it to yourself. Do not stop from reporting. The only thing that will happen is if you report it the next day, then the chances of you losing your job are very high. The timeline for reporting abuse is immediately. It's not after 2 hours. It's not after my lunch break. It's not at the end of the day, and it's definitely not the next day. You need to report abuse immediately. If you don't do that, the law says, Department of Justice says, if the associate does not report the abuse and it's substantiated, I have to terminate you. Not Raya's Paradise. Department of Justice says, I must terminate an associate who did not report abuse in a timely manner. So again, you suspect something, you hear something, you see something, the best thing to do is report it and let us take action and look to see if it's substantiated or not substantiated. Some situations are more difficult to decide to know if abuse has really occurred. This is when it's helpful to review and know the facts of the possible abuse, notifying your supervisor before calling the police. So the individual observing or suspecting abuse must be the person to report the incident. A supervisor cannot report the abuse. The person reporting the incident is not responsible for investigating the abuse. So again, you're reporting it doesn't mean that you are actually responsible for following through with the investigating. You report it. As long as you know that you report it to your supervisor and it's gone to the executive director, it's out of your hands. So again, making a report. Mandated reporters are required to report incidents as known of suspected abuse. So by telephone immediately or as soon as practical possible. Again, you're not reporting to the local law enforcement. That is left to the executive director and your supervisor. In California, a written report must also be completed and sent to within 2 working days to Adult Protective Services. So can't stress enough to you the abuse reporting. It is very, 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 very crucial inside of a community. We went over all the types of abuse. You watch the video. Should you have any questions, should you have any reason to believe or suspect that anything is going on, please, the best thing to do is just make the report. Okay? Thank you very much, and I hope that you learned from this abuse reporting. Should you have any questions, please see your executive director.